Well, welcome back, everyone, to UnSpun. This is show number 45, which is hard to imagine. I'm here, Joe Atwill, with Jan Irvin, and today you are in for one of the really, really special treats that anyone can ever experience in the alt-R mainstream media. We have a special guest, Robert Forte, and he's impossible to introduce. He's done everything. He knows everyone. Those who've been listening to our show have realized, that Jan and I have focused on the counterculture basically as weaponized anthropology, and we have gone through many, many individuals that can be plugged into the counterculture basically as a kind of government op. Excuse me, I'm still recovering from the cold. But anyway, Robert has known almost all these individuals. He is someone who is aware of our work and has been asking very, penetrating questions about it. Robert and Jan have known each other for a very, very long time. So, Robert, if you would just be so kind as to give the audience just a brief background of your relationship to the counterculture and to where you are now. What are you doing, brother?
Okay, well, what I thought I would do is put a couple of nuggets out, just say a couple of things. They're kind of related. And then I want to talk a little bit about my background and how it is that I came to know all of these people, and not just know them, but work with them. And you'll see I'm very much in agreement with what I have learned from you guys over the past, really several years. Joe and I have had just a few conversations over the past few months, and Jan and I first connected, I think maybe nearly 8 years ago.
About 8 years ago, yeah.
About 8 years ago, I think you first...
We've stayed pretty much in regular contact since then, several times a year or more.
Yeah. And I've had, as you will see, and as some people know, a very extensive involvement and study in the field of psychedelic drugs. And I'm largely in agreement with what you have been presenting over the past several years, and that I really want to commend you both for having exposed a covert operation of the government or of agencies within the government using psychedelic drugs, weaponizing psychedelic drugs as tools to distract and manipulate populations. I had been aware of some of these ideas when I first became interested in the subject of psychedelic drugs, but I'd kind of overlooked them. I'd read Martin Lee's book and I had known about MKULTRA, but really I was more interested in the positive, religious and psychotherapeutic aspects of the drugs. And so I kind of pushed that stuff aside for a little while. So I just want to make this point really clear right at the beginning, because I really don't want to have to contest it anymore, as we sometimes do, Jan, when we talk, that you and Joe and several other people who have presented this very, very disturbing aspect of our...
Well, I like to kid you, Bob, because, so many of these people, you're connected to so many of them, you could head MKUltra, right? You're right in the middle of all of them.
Yeah, I know. We joke about that sometimes. And sometimes your jokes seem kind of serious. And some of the ways that you attack people who have been involved in this field. And I don't want to spend a lot of time attacking each other or defending each other, but I want to enter into this conversation in a collegial way to discuss something that is of very great importance that affects millions.
Well, sure, but let's get back, to how did you get into this? Because you did study with, for instance, Mirca Eliade. You did his last interview like a week before he died, I think.
No,
and
Not quite. Let me get to that. Let me just lay these nuggets out first. So I want to say first that I agree with you, I commend you, and I want to help this inquiry and this revelation of MKUltra and the weaponization of psychedelic drugs. The work that you do is very, very important, and you and Joe and I'm grateful, and I commend you, and sometimes I wish I never met you. Okay. That's point number one.
You wish you were still mind controlled? Is that what you're saying, Bob?
I don't think I was ever really mind controlled. But
well, if you don't see the operation, you know, any form of trickery like that is a type of mind control. That's how mind control works.
Possibly. The second point I want to make. Now, really, I've studied the subject, as you know, thoroughly, at least one aspect of it. And I think it is my view that the subject of psychedelic drugs is very much like the subject of the history of religion in general. And that it's a microcosm of the history of religion. Now, in the field of religion, and Joe makes this point, you know, when he talks about Caesar's Messiah, religion spans the whole spectrum of human behavior, from the very best ideas of images of human fulfillment and enlightenment and moral and ethical systems, and the possible communion with other supernatural realities, all very good things. But also in the history of religion, we see the absolute opposite of that, and perhaps more so, that religion is a form of mind control. As Marx famously said, an opium or opiate of the masses, and it's used to control and subjugate populations. And
it's like my comment that you hear me say a lot, Bob. Mysticism is the tool of tyrants, and everywhere when we see this implemented, you know, there are the dupes on one side that get fooled into it, and then there are the controllers or the manipulators on the other side of it that are peddling it.
Yes, I agree with you, but it is not only the tool of tyrants. It is also the tool of revolutionaries. And that, you know, you and I've had to correct you once or twice that the origin of the word, the etymology of the word mysticism and mystery is not to mystify. It is actually means to shut your senses and or to be silent about. And so while I agree with you that mysticism can be and often is a tool of tyrants, you've made the point very well that psychedelic drugs are a tool of tyrants. There's another aspect of this. I mean, I had a spontaneous mystical experience when I was a young boy, just in nature. This remarkable feeling, it was very brief, down at a stream near where I lived, where I just felt a oneness, an empathy for all existence, and it changed me. I wondered why other people didn't have this kind of sensitivity to the environment and could live as if they were separate. So it was a spontaneous mystical experience, and these happen. And that's important to get out right at the beginning, not only because it's true, but because, and one thing that concerns me a lot, in order to persuade people of the correctness of this position, the weaponization of psychedelic drugs, we have to allow that a lot of people got into this subject, not just because they were tricked, but because they had bona fide, genuine, good reasons for being curious about
Let me just interject one idea here, Bob, is that with a lot of the New Age religion being sold out of SRI with Changing Images of Man and the Aquarian Conspiracy with Marilyn Ferguson, what we have is this primacy of consciousness, and we have this notion that's rampant throughout the New Age where people actually think that everybody else, including reality itself, is a reflection of them. Okay, so like they are God. It's the ultimate egoic position rather than being of the world. They actually believe that the world is a reflection of them. And I think this is a big problem within the New Age, because if you have this idea that everything is a reflection of you, that everything else doesn't have the right to exist, that you're this, you know, egoic God, then you're not going to realize that you are of the world, right? You're going to think that the world is of you. And so, you know, I think that even the New Age itself is a big part of the problem, and it's a pseudo environmental thing. It's there to dumb people down. They're not empowering people and uplifting them and saying, hey, let's look at the facts of this. You know, throughout the environmental, global warming, geoengineering, all of this stuff, there's so much false information out there that, you know, coming from the government that it's, you know, it's hard to tell. It's like petroleum. We've been told for a century that it's a fossil fuel when it's abiogenic, created by the volcanic action of the earth. So they've been lying about all of this and lying that it's, you know, that it's this pollutant when it's the lifeblood of the planet. You know, so there's all of these different levels of this that need to get exposed and dealt with on a logical level, whereas the mystical pseudo-spiritual experience that I fell for as well. And, you know, you and I met, I've written books on psychedelics, etc. And, you know, I understand the mystical experience. I've had them myself. When I look back, I think I got fooled. I think that, you know, like I wrote my article in Theogen's What's in a Name, even the name of these substances can determine the outcome of the experience. And I didn't have my first religious experience with them, quote unquote, until the day I met Timothy and Dennis McKenna, Timothy Leary.
But let me interject here. I think actually this is correct, and particularly so in the context of, you know, the counterculture, because obviously the government was not trying to promote religious experiences. They were looking for ways to control. However,
absolutely,
very interesting, Robert's experience as a young person, because this would have been an experience that was, you know, basically manifest before he would have been aware of any of the inputs from the government in terms of this stuff. I'm sure it was before you read the, you know, Life magazine's story about Gordon Wasson. So there is this, and this is really one of the real problems that anyone has in trying to expose the whole government operation, is that they take things which are so beneficial, are seemingly so beneficial, and then then weaponize them. Yeah. It's sort of like the archaic revival concept that Bateson came up with as an anthropologic control device for culture.
Native revival. McKenna renamed it to archaic.
However you want to call it, but it's just looking at your past as a culture that you want to embrace, and this obviously makes it very easy for a more technically sophisticated group to control you. But anyway, Robert, I wanted you to see if you would address that. You know, we have this problem of the legitimate spiritual experience, and then we have what has entered into our culture and basically overwhelmed it, because at this point I think that, you know, legitimate spiritual seekers are very few, whereas I see a lot of individuals and certainly going back in time, in the 60s and 70s, there were lots of people that were thinking they were having these experiences that had actually been taken there. So what do you think? You know, how will the legitimate experience of spirit, be sort of separated from what the government has done, and then how will the government's activity be clearly exposed, even though they oftentimes are using, you know, legitimate human experiences as the tool for the weaponization? I mean, so I wouldn't quite call it a dichotomy, but it is, at least you can see there's a semantical parsing that has to happen. So,
well, Joe, it's like you and I have often discussed, how do we keep the beneficial aspects of these religions without the mind control aspects?
Right, and that's what I was wondering if Robert would comment on that, because you seem to have really basically been at the kind of the ground zero of this problem, maybe even without knowing it, for basically your whole adult life. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you, because this is exactly what I want to try to speak to. You know, when and maybe my biography can illustrate some of this. When I'm just about 60 years old. I was born in 1956, so I was, you know, coming of age. I was 10 or 12 years old when psychedelics started happening in the society. I grew up in an area in the Northeast, outside of New York City, a kind of affluent area. And when I began to notice first it was the older brothers and sisters of my peer group get into psychedelic drugs. I thought my intuition, my feeling was that these kids, all my friends, they're getting all fucked up on these crazy drugs, and they're getting weirder and weirder. The music that they're listening to doesn't make any sense to me, and I found it very offensive. And I said to myself, I'm never going to go anywhere near those drugs. I fancied myself an athlete. I like to take care of myself. I got interested in cannabis at a young age, but I drew the line with these crazy things, the mushrooms and the LSD. I could sense that. And it wasn't until I was in my third year of college, and I had begun to practice meditation. My brother, actually, who was a couple years younger than me, persuaded me to take up this TM, that he thought it would help my athleticism, particularly my golf game. And so I got into this. I took a course in transcendental meditation, and I very disciplinedly sat down for 20 minutes in the morning and in the night, and I steadied my mind. And I found out that this simple practice had a remarkable effect on my life, transformed me in a way. I was a kind of mediocre student, didn't really know what I wanted to do, to finally really being able to study and sit down. And it changed my life. And I became interested in the history of religion. Like, how did these ancient people come up with this simple technology that had such remarkable effects? And so I was at Columbia, and I took a course in the history of religion. And in the first day, the professor mentioned the origin of Indian religion, and he referred to the Vedas and the Rig Veda, and that the Rig Veda was originally songs and poems that were collected during a fire sacrifice in which they consumed a drink called soma. And I remember him saying it. I can still see him writing on the board that this American banker named R. Gordon Wasson has figured out that this soma, this substance, was a kind of hallucinogenic mushroom. And I was very impressed. I was very moved by this moment. And I thought, wow, these drugs that my friends were getting all fucked up on as kids might actually have had some kind of right use and a real significance in the history of religion. And so I decided to study this. I began to read, and I was a very thirsty seeker, and I read everything. And I moved out to California, and I was lucky to have connected with a man named Frank Barron, who was a very significant figure in this psychedelic movement. Frank was Timothy Leary's best friend in graduate.
How did you meet Frank?
Well, Frank was on the faculty at the University of California in San Diego.
Okay.
And I was interested in his courses. He taught a course on Jung. He taught a graduate course on psychological assessment. And at this point in my life, I thought that's what I was going to do, that I was going to become a psychologist and help people, who were confused. And so before long, Frank and I had connected, and he began to tell me stories about Tim Leary. And I had expressed my interest in, wow, I'd never, at this point, I had not taken any psychedelic drugs except for cannabis. And I was, and Frank and I just began a relationship. And we talked about what had happened when the drugs were first introduced into the culture, that they were used by the psychiatric profession, which didn't really have the right paradigm to understand altered states of consciousness. In fact, at that point, we're in the 60s, psychiatry was a profession that was all about stopping altered states of consciousness. If you were having a vision, whether it was a hallucination or a vision, and you went to see your psychiatrist, they gave you something to stop that from happening. So there's the psychiatric use of these drugs. And then there was Timothy Leary, who had been a real problem, that he had popularized these drugs to an audience of people that by and large were not really ready.
Let me interject you there, because the reason why, Bob, is, Wasson in 1956, long before Leary at this stage, had already done the Life magazine article with teenage allowances on the front cover. Before that, you had Aldous Huxley publishing The Doors of Perception, etc., which went into mescaline. And, that was published at, in what, 60, I forget what year that was published. But, the idea that Leary is who popularized the drugs to the kids is a misnomer when we see that, and when we see this intentional thing with Ken Kesey and what appears to be multiple buses, not just one going around the country. And all of these different things, is clear that this was part of the plan, and that, Leary having gone rogue promoting LSD to the youth or whatever. I mean, that's the official storyline that they've used as a cover for the last 50, 60 years.
Yes, I know this is your position, and I'm not sure if you're right or wrong. I have to rely on my own experience. Well,
I think the evidence shows, with all of these people working together, and it's clear that Wasson was CIA, Huxley was heading MKUltra, Leary admits he was recruited in 62. We have all of these common themes that show if they're all working together, they're all doing the same thing, regardless of the surface rhetoric. The theme is the same. It's the promotion of the drugs. Leary and Arthur Koester, pedomorphosis, peddling this stuff to the youth. Koester's book, Ghost in the Machine, and this stuff lays it out. This is what they founded this stuff on.
Well, let me ask Robert a question. Robert, just so for clarification, do you think that Leary was a tangent unto itself? In other words, as we look at it, we see the project having begun much earlier than that, and Larry's activity was just obviously from if you look at the trajectory and all
a new rendition of it or whatever.
So we just see it that way. But do you believe that there was another way of understanding it, that perhaps Leary was basically kind of this existential phenomena, that wasn't really part of the process? How do you see Leary and this historical process?
Thank you, Joe. You raised this, you introduced this term, lifetime actor. Tim was a very complicated, I got to know Tim very well. I was, as I was saying, at first I was under the impression that he was the problem, that he was just sort of an egomaniacal guy who wanted to be famous his whole life, and these drugs came around. He was led into the field by Aldous Huxley and Frank Barron, and saw this as an opportunity for him to become personally famous, and he went against the advice of his most trusted friends, and it was that sort of narcissism and fame seeking that caused this thing to, like Huxley didn't want him to do this, Frank was always arguing with him, but Tim just wanted to be famous. You can read in his journals when he was just a kid that was what he wanted. And then he just kind of attached himself to these drugs and violated certain kind of rules of order that Huxley and Barron had wanted, that they needed to be more carefully used by people that were mature, and Tim just kind of blew that all out of his.
I've looked at all of those comments, and I've gone through all of that, and that claim is not supported by the evidence, because we see clearly Huxley again promoting his books to the youth. Gordon Wasson from the very beginning in 1956. Obviously, his daughter along for the trip. She's 16 doing mushrooms, all published in Life magazine. Teenage allowances right on the front cover. You have Valentina publishing her series in the Sunday newspaper that went out to, what was it, 20-some million, 16 million newspaper subscribers in one weekend. So they did a whole blitzkrieg on the youth all at once.
Well,
they attacked the entire youth, just broadside.
Well, let me say, first one point I want to make is that when you showed me that document, those series of documents that you got from CIA that showed that the whole revelation of the mushroom in Life magazine, that the official story that Wasson had told me himself, that was wrong, that Wasson was deliberately misleading.
Right. And you know what, Bob, let me interrupt you right there, because I'm just going to play that clip from your recording with Wasson, if that's all right. I have that clip queued up.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to that. Here we go.
The chemicals in the mushrooms are related families to the mushrooms in ergot.
Now, I understand that another mycologist, Rolf Singer, was right on your trail when you had gone down to Mexico, and also that the CIA was very interested in what he had done. Could you say some more things about the CIA's involvement in this?
Well, I won't say anything very strong or interesting. The CIA thought that they might be able to apply this to war, and they wished to investigate it. They called me up and asked me whether I would work with them, and I said, give me a day, I have to think it over. And I called him up the next day and said I would not. He would try my hands since I couldn't talk anymore. And so I said I wouldn't. I knew much more than they did about it. And then they put on my trail a man, a chemist, at the University of Maryland, and he came to me representing a foundation in West Virginia, I think, or something place, and said that he wished to get to see these mushrooms and go around there, see how they worked, and if I would take him along in my party, he would help finance the trip. Mm-hmm. Well, that was rather important for us, because these trips are a nuisance financially. And I said, all right, we'll take you along. And I took him along, and he wasn't a great success on the trip.
So you think that this was a person at the CIA that came in?
Well, yes, there was written on later by John Mack, was it?
John Marks.
John Marks.
Mm-hmm.
John Marks. He devotes a chapter to this episode in the.
Now, so that's basically the end of that clip. But what Wasson isn't admitting is, if you read John Marks's book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, it's very clear that Wasson wrote his own chapter in Marks's book so that he can refer to Marks's book as that being the official version of the story. And then we see Wasson even quoted in the beginning of the book as helping with for his assistance in writing the book there. And then, like you were saying, and I was just looking for that letter between Wasson and Alan Dulles. I've got the pay requisition letters here, but it's clear that Wasson knew Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA, personally, and they were sending personal letters back and forth between each other. I'm just seeing if I have a copy of that letter here.
Well, let me just interject one thing. The clip that
I've got the thing here, so I'll show that while you're talking.
All right. Well, the clip is really of critical historical importance. That clip is absolutely necessary for every American citizen to listen to and to juxtapose it against the MKUltra documents.
Yes.
Because that shows that Wasson is a lifetime actor.
Right.
Now, look on the screen here, just really quick to interrupt you, Joe. This is April 3, 1957. This is 6 weeks before the May 1937 article to Life magazine, or in Life magazine. This is between Gordon Wasson. This is approved for release 2003 by the CIA. The CIA sent me this letter via FOIA request. And so this is from Alan Dulles to Wasson. We know that it's for sure Alan Dulles, even though they blocked out his name down here. We have this letter right here, from June 3rd, 1960. So Wasson has got an ongoing conversation with Dulles. It wasn't just a one-time thing that he was talking to him. We see, Dulles saying, let me know if you're in Washington, let's go hang out. Let's go, slap a beer back. Or
right. Well, so Wasson had a really dense relationship. It wasn't just a one-off. He was
this one, they actually didn't block off Alan Dulles' name.
Okay, well, I think all of this material is great, and it shows how clear it is that Wasson had this relationship with the CIA, but this goes back to how important it is for people to know that he's a lifetime actor. Yeah. So I just want to make 2 points. One, the document that was first on the screen, which is the pay requisition for the trip to Mexico, was from Gordon Wasson. So that his statement that he attempted to avoid employment through the CIA is false. That
absolutely, when he was the one that wrote that, which I have
exactly. So there it is. Okay. Then the second thing is in the tape and in Robert's keen interview with Wasson, Wasson gives the cover narrative that the CIA wanted to see about these drugs because they're interested in how they would be used during war.
Yeah.
Now, this is the statement of a lifetime actor. It is misdirection. You see, this goes into the classic born identity Manchurian candidate concept that the CIA was trying to use to get people away from recognizing that the real purpose was a cultural one during peacetime. It wasn't about creating an individual super agent like the born identity character. It wasn't something that was going to be used during war. It was something that was going to be used during peacetime for manufacturing psychological consent to the oligarchs. So anyway,
here's now I'm going to show on screen, Joe, what the letter looks like, actually cleared up. And by going through Wasson's personal letters, I was able to fill in that, he was going on a trip to Europe, that it was Roger Heim that he was discussing, et cetera, in that document. So here's what that document says when it's not all blotted out by the CIA. There's a couple of people that we don't know up here at the top, if it was James Moore or who these doctors up here. But it's clear, this is 1956, that it was Wasson that had been on 3 prior expeditions, and this is his 4th. James Moore, which is the official story, had never been on any expeditions per the official version of the story, so that's out. And then we see Wasson discussing, I'm leaving for a trip, which was redacted by the CIA, to Europe, which I have found in Wasson's personal letters at the end of March. Gone for 2 months before my departure for Huautla de Jimenez, and so all of this, including Roger Heim, the National Museum, French, et cetera, this was all redacted by the CIA, but it was pretty easy to piece a lot of this back together.
Right. We interrupted Robert, though. So, Robert, look, you can see, we have I think, just a completely clear-cut basis for understanding that the CIA was trying to develop the counterculture.
Yes.
So in light of this, it must be difficult, or at least I presume that it has given you second thoughts about Leary's connection into the counterculture. Where are you today with your understanding of Leary? Can you help us understand, what do you think about the guy? Was he part of the counterculture? Was he just an egotist, or was there a combination of the two? What do you think Leary was, your opinion?
I think Tim was one of the most mercurial, and this question has obsessed me for many years, Joe. I'm remembering now a time when I lived at his house for 3 or 4 days a week during the last year or so of his life. I became very close with him, and Tim was very mercurial and like a there was one time I was watching him near the end of his life, and there were some times when this guy appeared to be the most one of the most enlightened, funny, centered, joyful kinds of people you'd ever meet. It was impossible not to like him. But there were other times when he would you could see he was going through a lot of torment near the end of his life. And he was he was part prophet, and he was part, I don't want to use the word psychopathic, but it's coming out anyway, a kind of psychopathic madman, a twisted pain.
And he admitted that he was a psychopath as well.
Yes, he admitted that sometimes, and he had a very, very complex and amazing kind of epic life, and I still wonder about all of these questions. I don't think there's any way you can say Timothy Leary was like this. If you look at the whole course of his life, he would flip back and forth from one thing to another. He had kind of demonic aspects, and he had some of the kindest, most luminous sort of aspects.
Did he ever talk to you about Aleister Crowley?
No, I never talked with him about Crowley. And and near the end there, when I wanted to engage him in conversations about the CIA, he didn't really want to go there. He did leave me with one very I'd read this stuff. I'd known about the Walter Board interview. And even though I never knew Walter Board, I knew Peggy Hitchcock and I were good friends for a number of years. And, I knew about all that stuff. I knew that Frank...
And just for disclosure very quickly, I have been at Tim Leary's house. That's me standing there with the baseball cap behind this guy. Right there, you can see my baseball cap sticking out there. But just for disclosure, I am right there. I was at Leary's house once for a party for the California Hemp Initiative or whatever it was for. So anyway, and that's actually Tim Leary's house there where you stayed.
Yeah. Frank Barron and I had lunch together once a month for about 15 years. After I had graduated from school, we remained close. He was a mentor for me. I was on this project to try to kind of resurrect the subject of psychedelic drugs, learning from the mistakes of the previous wave. I was never interested in popularizing psychedelic drugs to young people, using them in any sort of political way. I was interested in them purely as a scholar and scientist in the field of the psychology of religious experience, and that under certain circumstances, a person who was correctly prepared could learn something very profound about the psyche. And if this was done in secret, away from all this sensationalism, we might learn a great deal about the mind. That was what I was working on establishing with Frank and with these conferences that I organized, including conferences at Esalen and at Harvard, and that's how I met Wasson at the University of California, down in Los Angeles. This is what I and the people closest to me were trying to do. We saw something of great value in the drugs themselves, in the right hands. And so I'm mentioning this point because there are a lot of people who feel the way that I do about them. And this information that you bring up.
Here's what concerns me, though, Bob.
Let me get this out.
John, let Bob finish.
All right.
This information that you guys are bringing forward, that Joe just summarized, that you both just summarized, with the CIA deliberately starting this thing that we've come to know as the psychedelic movement.
Well, and your friends.
Friends or teachers or people I was studying with. This is an earth-shaking revelation that the CIA intentionally publicized this mushroom in an attempt to start a movement. I'm agreeing with you. I think this is really important, and I talk about this a lot.
Not just the mushroom, the whole thing across the board.
The whole thing. Now, Tim Leary is a more complicated actor in this thing. Joe, you use this thing, lifetime actor. I'm not sure where Tim is in that. You have to look at Tim's life. You know, Tim was an anti-authoritarian guy. He hated totalitarianism. He hated the CIA. He was loyal to the idea of democracy, but he flipped a lot. Of all of these characters that you guys have exposed or revealed as being agents and actors in this MKUltra.
What about his admission that he hated the proletariat?
Timothy Leary is the only one, and I don't want to get into defending him because I really want to keep an open mind. I'm still looking for documents, but he's the only, these guys, Wasson, when Wasson talked about Leary, he hated Leary. When Janiger talked about...
See, I disagree. I think that's the cover story.
I know that, man. You may be right,
because we see Leary going to Wasson's house, and then we've got B.H. Friedman's book that states that Leary and him were sending all of the information to Wasson for all of Leary's research at Harvard.
Yeah, you got to give me a chance to express myself and get certain points across. Again, I don't want to get into a polemic, I want to explore this. I don't really...
Well, I'm just looking at, I know the official story says that Wasson hated Leary, and, Wasson, even in the beginning of your recording with him, attacks the idea of the word hallucinogen, which was created by Osmond and, Huxley and Hoffer and them. And then... and then he creates this new word with Ruck, which we've gone into. But the issue, which I exposed in that article in Theogens, What's in a Name, is that they cause hypersuggestion. They're suggestogens.
Yeah, but I'm actually quite curious about this. So Robert, you're kind of very carefully parsing Leary as a question mark, and his personality was very complicated, and you can imagine him having his relationship into the project that the government created, basically from this complex personality that he had. So when you see the video of basically what is called the MKUltra reunion party, and I'm sure you've looked at some of that, we've talked about it. So do you think that Tim's personality in that party was simply being massaged by all the other individuals? In other words, when you see their basically the intellectual unification that all of the individuals had, and many of them are completely outed as MKUltra monsters. Sidney Cohen and Humphrey Osmond. I won't go on to like some of the experiments these guys are doing, but Larry is just plugged right into them. So how do you explain that? Is that just an example of a very complicated person that was able to be manipulated, or is it possible that he was simply a government agent who was representing a complex personality as part of his cover narrative? How do you see that?
Well, I see this as something that really needs to be explored. My experience of all of these guys is that Tim was different. Tim, I believe, but I don't know, I think that Tim really tried to fuck with what they were doing. And
what about Leary even writing the entrance exams for the CIA? I mean, to me, that's what Leary was doing. He's doing exactly the whole operation that the CIA wanted. You think of Vito Palakis and
I'm curious about Robert. So Robert, well, how do you defend this? This is what I'm interested in. Is Robert, how do you actually make this argument, make the case that Leary was independent? Let's hear the conclusion of this.
The one basic fact of this that I tried to get out a second ago, of all of these guys that were breaking drug laws and causing all this ruckus, Tim is the only one that spent any significant time in prison. They busted him. They went after him. They fucked him over.
That's the story, yeah.
They subjected him to some real hell. They threatened to throw him in jail for... They threatened to throw him in jail for 30 years. They busted him again. Nixon called him the most dangerous man in America. And in my mind, I think that could be because they knew that Leary knew about this MKUltra.
Now, what about Leary stating openly that he tried to sell the rights to his prison escape before he did it?
Well, you're getting into an area that I'm also trying to research. I'm writing about this myself.
Well, because that's the softball story that you're selling, but Leary admits that he tried to sell the rights to Hollywood before the prison escape.
No, I think.
Here's what I think happens, Bob.
I think, I'm not sure, that prison.
Bob,
just let me get this out.
Here's the thing, Bob, is you have.
I believe that Tim went in and out of the CIA, and he used them when he needed to, and they used him when he needed to, but he had no real loyalty to them, and he was a complicated.
Here's the thing why I disagree with you is because there's a division, especially back in the 60s and 70s, between local and federal governments. And what he was doing down in Orange County and down in Laguna Beach, about an hour from here, and with the Brotherhood of Eternal Love and all of that stuff, that is one thing that the Laguna Beach police chief investigated him for and busted him for. And then he's tried at the Orange County Superior Courts, and then he's put in minimum security San Luis Obispo prison, slow prison, where wait for it, because this is the key point, where he himself wrote the inmate psychological exams. Now, of course, he gets his choice of cell. The official story is that he does this, arm over, hand over hand over the telephone wires and over the wall and escapes. Yeah. But he admits all of this, that they tried to sell it. But, what we have here is a division properly between local government and feds. They staged the whole escape thing. The CIA gets him out as soon as they could, and we see him bragging that his rights were for sale. Yeah. Before he did it.
Yeah. Well, Robert, this is really an interesting question, because if between the three of us we're able to actually create a completely transparent understanding of Leary, one that the public will, have no chance to do anything other than accept because it's just so clear cut, then I think this would be a really important moment. It would be, tantamount to another Gordon Wasson kind of event. And I think that we actually, in my opinion, I think we can basically work through the very best case, the one that you described, where Leary is sort of this existential miracle that can move in and out of the CIA while they're having this plot, but he's always basically his own person. He hasn't really accepted the creed of the CIA that is putting out this this counterculture. But I think that we probably can get to the point where that is just not something that I think is defensible. That's really what I'm trying to work toward, and that's why I am happy that you're putting forward the counter argument, because in going through the process of trying to figure out what is plausible, I think if Leary is as guilty as I believe he is, then there really should be a way to get to the point where we're so clear on the data that that it would be something that you would accept. And I think that this would be a great moment, because I know you're writing the movie about Leary. Basically, this could become the most official biography of Tim, because it'd be the one that the public would see in the film. So it'd be fantastic if the process could work in that way, where you would end up saying, okay, it's just completely transparent to me.
Now, before you jump in there is a segment that I would like to play here. And this is going to start with Dr. Humphrey Osmond. This is from the MKULTRA reunion video with all of the agents together there, all of the co-conspirators. And so anyway, let's play this clip here, because this is Leary saying it in his own words, out of his own mouth.
There's no sound in my world.
I don't know. I've got it full blast. Not as good as Papillon. Yes, yes, yes. They're talking about the film Papillon.
Yeah, no, I know that.
Hold on just a second, because it's going to get good here.
Are we going to be able to hear?
Here it is. Let me back it up again.
Can we hear their words? Or are you going to have to read it?
I can't hear them now.
Okay, well, the audio is playing. The issue is that the video audio is too low, and I've got it cranked up full blast. I don't know if there's a way that I can.
Well, I tell you what, you have the transcript. Why don't you just read it? Because I'd like to get.
All right. Well, all right. So that's the actual clip where Larry is saying it, and so here, let me just show it on the screen here again. And so Larry says it's not as good as Papillon. That's the film with Dustin Hoffman and Steve McQueen from 1973. Osmond says, no, but it's true. And Larry laughs and says, oh, yes, yes, yes. And then Osmond, Papillon gives you the feeling that it was being written for a movie. But unfortunately, yours hasn't been made into a movie. But it's a very good one. And then Larry says, well, I tried to sell the rights before The Escape, but Hollywood wasn't ready. Osmond, that would be the best possible move. Have a movie coming out before you escape. Leary, when the weathermen came up in the car for Escape, I knew it was the weathermen, and I turned and they had false passports, false clothes, something or other he's saying there, and I turned to them and said, didn't you videotape this, you fools? And they didn't. No. Cohen, well, here we are. Leary, it's a great tribute to Oscar. And that's Oscar Janiger, of course, whom you also knew. And then Janiger says, how would you have liked to have seen it go, this prison escape? I want to know how Al would have liked to have seen it go, because I think of what we are in here, one has to sort of a temporal network or bridge system in which people are seeing the same things through somewhat different lenses. Cohen, well, I think we need people like Tim and Al. Okay, Cohen, Sidney Cohen, publicly was Leary's nemesis, and they went around the country doing lectures together, and they played this dialectic, opposites on opposite sides of this. And here is Cohen sitting in the room saying, I think we need people like Tim and Al. They're absolutely necessary to get out, way out, too far out in order to move this shit.
Okay, well, I mean, that's too much information, though, unfortunately, because I think Robert will have a hard time responding to, there's so many details. But just getting back to the general idea, in that video, Humphrey Osmond states that he and Huxley hired Tim for a role. And in the context, it's clear that this was part of the operation that they were creating. I mean, this everything inside the discussion that's going on is about the general operation. And so that strikes me as, well, it would be very unlikely that they would have hired someone for the role that Larry was going to perform, who wasn't someone who was a witting agent inside of the operation. Have you seen that? There, Jan is highlighting it there. Have you seen that, Robert? That particular dialogue that took place between Larry and Osmond?
Yes, I'm well aware of that dialogue, and I think that you're right. That conforms with my experience and my intuition that Huxley, who I had first thought, all of us in this field, we just sort of naturally thought that Huxley was a kind of progressive intellectual, and now there's a kind of re-examination of Huxley, the eugenicist, and that Brave New World wasn't as warning so much as it was a prophecy and a blueprint.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a really big shift. And then Osman, who, when people first study this field, he seems like the gentlemanly, psychiatrist. Also, unfortunately, had these, dark MKUltra associations. I think we have to really, this is important for people that want to be serious.
Well, and that's the case with Leary and with all of them. That's why the lifetime actor, they present one thing to the public when in reality they're doing this devious, cult magic on everyone.
I'm just saying, again, based on many years talking about this, and with Frank Barron, like Frank Barron, when you talk about the prison escape, Frank and I talked about this many years ago. Frank didn't buy it. Frank thought that this was that this didn't quite add up, that this was inconsistent with Leary's character to do something like that, and he suspected some sort of operation, like you guys are saying. And Frank, is another guy that I don't think Frank was a lifetime actor. I think that Frank was part of this operation, and then it offended him. I think you have to allow for the possibility that people got involved in something and then realized it was wrong and and offended them. Frank had asked me nothing to do with psychedelics after his initial involvement with them. He look at the whole course of his life and the work that he did in the psychology of creativity and his attempting to use psychology as a remedy for the nuclear bomb scenario that we were facing. And he didn't.
One thing I was going to say is that I always believe that one of the ways you can always tell the lifetime actor is because of the amount of publicity they get.
Yeah.
Someone like Frank Barron's is just virtually an unknown, whereas, when you look at the MKUltra doctors and all of them basically are known to the public, Leary, of course, so that, you do have government spooks. You have Captain Al Hubbard, who's not that well known to the public. You look into his background, he's just CIA all the way. He's Leary's very...
Jolly West is another one.
Yeah, okay. But obviously the whole purpose of the organization and the movement was to sweep people up into it. I mean, it wasn't just to be part of an operation of CIA agents. It was, the whole idea was to sweep people up. And so many people who were interested in the field were swept up.
Right.
It's impossible, I think. We don't have enough data to be able to go back and parse everyone out, who this was a lifetime actor, this is a CIA guy, and this was someone who just swept up, who was interested in the, these items and just became part of the movement. I look at, when you look at like the acid tests and you see the Grateful Dead and you see Ken Kesey, I mean, this is lifetime acting. Right. Then you look backwards into the literature of Kesey and into the Freemason and all the Bohemian Grove connections of the Grateful Dead, and you've got a pretty clear picture. Right. But many of the individuals, Frank Barron would be a tier down from Leary, and I can imagine him just being someone who's very sincere and got swept up. Leary, on the other hand, because of the fact that he was hired, and I think if you look at the context of what Osman is saying about the hiring, they are expecting Leary to be a lifetime actor. And his background in the CIA before the hiring, I mean, this just, to me, it's very, very suggestive that this was an operative, that he was a witting agent. He wasn't just. Let me
just make one. Hold on. Let me make one point here also, because one thing that confuses a lot of people about the official version of the story is Leary's getting fired from Harvard in 1963 with the exposure in the Harvard Crimson by Dr. Andrew Weil. And I wrote about this in Spies in Academic Clothing. It appears from the evidence that Weil's exposure was just an old trick using the Hegelian dialectic, problem, reaction, solution, or thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Without Leary having been fired from Harvard, he'd never have been able to create the appearance of the hippie guru he'd later used to promote psychedelics to the youth for the CIA and Huxley and Osman, etc. So anyway, go ahead, Bob.
Well, again, I'm not disputing that Tim was a factor in the CIA's MKUltra operation to disseminate psychedelic drugs in the society. I think that that's true. He was. Now, whether he was unilaterally and completely involved in the plan without reservations, without, trying to fuck with them, I'm not so sure about that. You know, if we go back to the
We only have about a minute left.
back to the interaction when Huxley and Osman recruited Leary, you know, they thought that he was too square, that he was too proper, too established.
Yeah, but we're talking about them hiring him out of the Harvard Social Relations Department, which is social relations. So, you know, I mean, he was a leading personality, social relations.
Unfortunately, we're just not going to get to a lot of the stuff.
We're going to have to bring you back, Bob.
Robert, I mean, you're just too interesting, brother. I hope you can come back and, you know, maybe we can you create a kind of some text that you can basically create that will help us keep a little more focused to get through some of these things. I know there's a lot of stuff you didn't get a chance to say. I had so many more questions. Robert, hey, thank you very, very much. Go to CaesarsMessiah.com, buy all the books. Jan, you want to tell people about your website?
Gnosticmedia.com. Please support the work, buy the books. Bob, do you have a website? And
No,
of course, your book,
I do have
Infusions in the Future of Religion is your book.
That's one of my books, and I also did a memorial volume for Timothy Leary, which is partly a critique of his behavior and partly an acknowledgement of a method within.
All right, and we're actually out of time already, so.
Fine. Well, I'll be glad to do it again.
All right, we'll have you back soon. Bye-bye.
If we want to change the world, we must first change the media. Mainstream media exists for the purposes of indoctrination and manipulation of public perception. The world of free and independent media is growing, and with the upsurge in information now available in the public domain, it has never been easier to access free and independent media. The exploration of this information resulted in an experimental project which would provide a fully supported space for researchers, whistleblowers, and seekers of all kinds to express themselves and educate the world. On the 1st of January 2015, Conscious Consumer Network was launched to the world. Nobody thought we would make it this far, but CCN is the longest running free and independent media network of its kind. CCN is a unique collaboration of hearts and souls, bringing you information from different perspectives to educate and inform. Since we started CCN, we have had only one desire, the pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world, and this has not changed. Having overcome many challenges over the last 2 years, CCN is here to stay, and we've got great things lined up for 2017. Help keep CCN on the air by supporting the 2017 Network Support Fund.